For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. When a player gets traded to a different team, there are, shall we say, many different reactions that a player can have to the news. Some people say absolutely nothing, and just put out the most generic boilerplate statement ever, saying that they're excited to be with their new team, and they're grateful for their old team giving them an opportunity. Some people can be tearful and express immense sadness if they're leaving their current situation behind. And heck, there are some instances where a player is so adamant about not leaving and not playing anywhere else that they'll refuse to go, and will even threaten retirement. Every player is different, and everyone reacts to this situation in different ways. But of all the ways to react to the situation, I don't think there have been any like the one we're about to talk about today. Because this player that you've been watching this whole time is a running back on the Chicago Bears by the name of Ronnie Bull. And he exhibited something that many players exhibit after getting traded: a desire for vengeance. He expressed a desire for his old team to suffer, thinking that they made a mistake in getting rid of him, and hoping that they regret this moment for the rest of their lives. But I don't want to overreact, but maybe he took it one step too far and just went a teeny tiny bit over the line and went a bit, shall we say, cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs when he got traded after nearly a decade of playing with the Chicago Bears. And more than half a century later, it deserves a deep dive today for just how insane this entire situation was. Because this is the story behind Ronnie Bull, and what might just be, considering the circumstances, the most vengeful player in the history of the National Football League. Before I talk about the actual incident in question and the insanely bizarre comments, we need some context to understand just who this man right here, Ronnie Bull, was, and why he was on his way out in the first place. In 1962, there was a running back coming out of Baylor who was highly coveted by teams in both the American Football League and the National Football League, with the Dallas Texans and Chicago Bears both spending their first-round pick on Bull. In the end, Bull decided to sign with the Chicago Bears, and immediately the decision paid dividends, as in 1962, Bull ended the season with nearly 700 yards from scrimmage, and was productive enough to win AP Rookie of the Year honors in rather convincing fashion. Bull's presence in the backfield the following year in 1963, alongside guys like Joe Marconi and Rick Caceres, would help propel the Bears to an NFL championship. And in 1965 and 1968, Bull was one of the most efficient runners in all of football, averaging 4.6 and 4.4 yards per carry respectively, which ranked 4th and 6th in the league amongst all qualified players. Bull was a very good running back up the inside and up the middle. He was very tough to take down. And entering the 1971 season, as in the season in question, Bull had been with the Bears for 9 years, and had amassed over 4,200 yards from scrimmage, just being a consistent presence in the backfield for nearly a decade. For some perspective, the Bears were the model franchise in NFL history by this point, having been named champions of the NFL 8 times, which was the most in the league. They had a ton of incredible players and a huge legacy, to say the least. And by this point in franchise history, even despite all of that, Bull was so good that he ranked 6th in franchise history in yards from scrimmage, with the only 5 guys ahead of him being Rick Caceres, Gale Sayers, Johnny Morris, Harlan Hill, and Mike Ditka. Not bad company to be in, if I do say so myself. However, entering the 1971 season, it was clear that Bull's time with the Bears was nearing its natural conclusion. He was on the wrong side of 30, and his stats in just about every category were on the decline, with his 274 yards from scrimmage across the 12 games played being the lowest total of his entire career. And if that wasn't enough, the Bears were doing their absolute best to push him out and make room for some younger blood. Don Shai, who was second on the Bears in rushing yards in 1970, was coming back, as was the incomparable Gale Sayers. And the Bears also decided to spend a whopping 4 draft picks on the running back position, loading up in that department. One of those guys was Willie Lewis, a 14th round pick out of Arizona, so the Bears weren't expecting him to do anything or make the roster. Guys in the 14th round back then were more often than not guys who did not play a single down in the league. But their first 2 draft picks? Well, they were 2 Missouri running backs in Joe Moore and Jim Harrison, as the Bears, trying to build a backfield that could get them through the 1970s, took 2 running backs inside the top 30, along with Dennis Farris, a Pitt running back in round 7. It was quite clear based on Bull's declining play in recent years, the fact that he hadn't scored a touchdown in the past 2 seasons, and based on Chicago's offseason, that Bull was going to be on the outside looking in sooner rather than later. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened, because in July of 1971, the Bears traded this man right here, Ronnie Bull, to the Philadelphia Eagles in exchange for a draft pick. After nearly a decade in Chicago, where he was an extremely consistent and extremely efficient player, Bull's time in the Windy City was officially over. And for Bull, there were many ways he could have taken the news and exited Chicago, as he could have been extremely graceful and classy in his exit. As you're about to find out, however, yeah, he was anything but that. Now, the first few comments that Bull made upon this trade to the Eagles were a bit bizarre, but nothing too noteworthy in the grand scheme of things. He talked about how he knew absolutely nothing about the Eagles roster. He didn't know the other running backs or players on the team, and he didn't know what the situation was there, saying, "I have no earthly idea who I have to beat out. I'm just going to go there and try to make the ball club. I've just got an hour to catch my plane, and I haven't had a chance to look at the Eagles roster." He also talked about how he was excited to now be playing in 1971 because he would get great benefits as a result, saying, "It will give me an opportunity to play that 10th year I wanted to play, not only to qualify for maximum pension benefits, but just to wind up my career with a nice even figure." This statement is a bit bizarre in the sense that by saying he wants to end his career with a nice even figure at 10, that he's more likely than not hinting at the fact that the 1971 season will be his last year in the NFL, and that no matter what, he's hanging up the cleats and calling it a career after this year. Not sure the Eagles necessarily make that trade if they knew that fact in advance. Not sure that's the best thing to say right after getting traded that, "Oh yeah, by the way, this is my last hurrah, so I hope you didn't give up too much for me, and I hope you knew that, but whatever." This man was a running back on the wrong side of 30. I'm not going to look too much into that comment. We knew retirement was coming sooner rather than later. It was on the horizon. But then, he got, shall we say, oddly vengeful of the fact that he couldn't finish his career with the Bears. He was angry that the Bears let him go, and felt as though they were trying to get rid of him unceremoniously for a while. Said Bull, "They've been trying for years to get rid of me, but I kept fighting my way to the top. This time, I didn't get the chance." I think we can infer what that means. Saying something like, "This team didn't give me a chance to compete, and they never wanted me here," means that you definitely left on some bad terms. You definitely got that sense back in 1970, when Bull was a healthy scratch for some games for some reason. Said Bull, after being ineligible to play for a period of time, despite being in great health and conditioning, "There's absolutely nothing wrong with me. I was deactivated because they needed to make room for 2 other players." I'll go along with that reasoning up until a point. I don't blame them for doing that, but my only question is, why me? Why couldn't they have demoted somebody else instead of me, as long as I'm feeling good? So there was definitely some hard feelings and some animosity that was brewing between he and the organization and the coaching staff. And this trade was the culmination of that. And again, that's not really a story. There have been plenty of trades where there was bad blood between the 2 parties by the end of it, and there will continue to be trades where that animosity exists in the future. But then, things got incredibly out of hand, because it was at that point that Bull talked about the other running backs on the Bears who were supposedly looking good and were going to be ahead of Bull on the depth chart entering 1971. Those guys were, as mentioned before, Joe Moore, Jim Harrison, and Dennis Ferris. Those guys were the first-round pick out of Missouri, the second-round pick out of Missouri, and the seventh-round pick out of Pitt. And of those three guys, Bull, without ever playing with them or really getting to know them, said, quite bluntly, "I hope they all break their legs." That's right. He hoped that all the rookie running backs that the Bears drafted broke their legs, and clearly not in the theatrical sense like when you encourage someone to break a leg. He legitimately meant that he wanted all of the running backs on the Bears to break their legs. And from everything I could tell, especially the context surrounding the departure, he wasn't kidding. He legitimately seemed like he wanted the guys who beat him out to break their legs. Now look, I completely understand the idea of wanting to prove your team wrong. I completely understand when a team lets you go in favor of someone else, that you want to play better than those guys to show your former team what they're missing out on. It's a completely natural feeling. You want to make your former employer regret everything, and you want to make your former employer feel as though they made the wrong decision by keeping one guy over you. But to root for all of those guys to break their legs? To openly root for an injury? For guys that did literally nothing to you outside of being on your team? I mean, that's another level of vengeance entirely. Especially because you're a player yourself. You know how important it is to stay healthy. You know how important your legs are to your success. And how if you don't have your legs, especially as a running back of all positions, you're completely screwed and your career could be over. So for you to wish that all of these guys would break their legs just because they beat you out on the depth chart and forced your departure out of Chicago, this is incredibly uncalled for. And for that to be your lasting legacy? Like, come on. For a lot of people, it's natural for us to remember first and last impressions. A lot of the stuff in the middle gets muddled over time, but your first impression of someone and your final impression of someone is what gets remembered. If a movie has a great ending, even if the rest of it isn't very good, you remember it way more fondly than a movie that's great 90% of the time, but the final 10% left you unsatisfied. People are going to talk about Super Bowl 58 for a long, long time, even though the first 3 quarters of that game were dreadful. And here, the final impression that fans had with Ronnie Bull was that parting shot and those final words that he said before hopping on the flight to Philadelphia, where he hoped everyone that beat him out would break their legs. I'm not saying you had to have a graceful exit or anything like that, believe me. If you think the Bears screwed you over, then by all means, say that, and you have every right to feel that way. But you do not, under any circumstances, have the right to hope that the players that beat you out break their legs and suffer devastating injuries. When the Jaguars lost Calvin Ridley to the rival Titans in free agency, it's one thing for me to say as a fan, I hope he doesn't do well, and the Titans are stuck with him and that contract, and I hope we beat him every time we play him. It's another thing entirely for me to say, I hope Calvin Ridley tears his ACL. There's a clear line here, and it should be very obvious that Bull stepped a solid 20,000 paces over the line. And I can't really say that this worked out for either party at the end of the day. In terms of the 3 rookie running backs that Bull lost out to on the initial depth chart, that he hoped broke their legs and suffered devastating injuries because they had the audacity to wear the same uniform that he did, none of them did anything in the NFL, so he sort of got his wish. The Bears went all in at running back with a youth movement, and they failed badly. 7th round pick Dennis Ferris never played a down in the NFL. 2nd round pick Jim Harrison only had 1,099 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns in his career. And 1st round pick Joe Moore was one of the biggest busts in franchise history, as despite being taken 11th overall, he finished his career with 281 rushing yards and 0 rushing touchdowns. Even though the first round of the 1971 NFL Draft had some really solid running backs in it like John Brockington, Don McCauley, and Hall of Famer John Riggins, it's safe to say that Joe Moore was not one of them, so the Bears went 0 for 3. As for the man that you've been watching this whole time in Ronnie Bull, he did next to nothing in Philadelphia. Even though he led the team in rushing yards, he did it with just 351 yards, and he never found the end zone on the ground, which seems insane to believe that a team's leading rusher scored 0 rushing touchdowns. Bull retired after the 1971 season, which, based on the comments he made earlier, shouldn't have come as too much of a surprise. He played 10 years and was done once he could get the maximum pension benefits. So neither party got the better end of the deal. Bell did nothing, and the guys he lost out to in Chicago did nothing. But the grand lesson of this story should be pretty obvious nonetheless. Don't wish for people to break their legs. I don't mean in the musical theater sense. I mean literally, don't wish for people to break their legs. Especially if your reason for it boils down to jealousy. You can be vengeful all you want about a team cutting ties with you. You can think they made the worst mistake ever. You can feel angry and betrayed and everything else that goes along with that. Believe me, I'm not going to hold that against you if you've got an issue with the organization. But to take it out on the players, especially guys you never played with, yeah, that's not a good look at all. Because in 1971, Ronnie Bull left the Bears on the worst possible terms, with a comment and a thought that did not have a single leg to stand on. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.